Welcome back to another Tactical Fly Fisher video. I am your host and the owner of Tactical Fly Fisher, Devin Olson. In this video, we're going to be covering the topic of fishing 1 versus 2 flies on a Euro nymphing rig, or really on any nymphing rig. But in this specific video, I'm going to take you through the theory behind it, look at some different water types, and then talk about where and when you might want to fish 1 versus 2 flies. And then in another follow-up video that we just shot, I'm going to take you out on the water and show you a specific sequence for each piece of water that I chose to fish 1 fly versus a piece of water that I chose to fish 2, and the whole execution of that sequence in both cases. But in this video, let's jump into the concepts behind fishing 1 versus 2 flies and my thought process on this topic. The reason behind this video, over the last year or two, I've both watched some anglers at competitions fish and seen some posts on social media that suggest that a lot of people are not very adaptive when it comes to the number of flies they use on their rig. I've seen quite a few anglers stick with 1 fly in water types where I felt they would have been better served by 2, where as a result they did not get down in those specific holding laws very well and didn't catch very many trout. Whereas if they switched to 2, had a little bit more weight, maybe a little longer rig, and maybe spread those weight between 2 smaller flies, they might have been able to catch a few more fish. But I've also seen anglers fish 2 flies in some really complicated, turbulent pocket water where I felt like 1 fly probably would have served them better. The reality is, if you go out and look at a lot of rivers, there are water types within all of those rivers where 1 fly might make the most sense, and other water types where 2 flies might make the most sense. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the water types and the situations where I think it makes the most sense for either. Let's first cover some of the pros and cons of fishing 1 fly or 2 flies when you're Euro nymphing, and then I'm going to dive into some specific video examples of water types where I chose either 1 or 2 flies and give you the reasoning behind it. Let's start with 1 fly. What are the pros or the benefits of only having 1 fly on your Euro nymphing rig? The first thing is you've only got 1 point of weight. And if you have 1 point of weight, you have 1 point of contact between your sighter and that weight that's providing the tension that's on your sighter to get strike detection. So you do get more direct and quicker strike detection on a 1 fly rig. In addition, when you only have that 1 point of weight, it's easier to cast accurately. You can fit 1 fly into tight spots along banks or under trees that you might have to bow and arrow cast into, or really small pockets behind rocks where it'd be difficult to fit 2 flies spaced a little bit apart, but you can easily fit 1 fly into these little tight spots. So for more accurate casting and casting into technical tight little corners where you need to avoid maybe putting a fly in a tree, then 1 fly is definitely a better option in those cases. Following on that train of thought, when you're fishing really complex water, and by that I mean water that has a lot of turbulence, water that has a lot of knife edge current seams where it goes from slow to fast in short distances across the width of the water, so maybe 12 inches or less, or even 20 inches or less. If you go from a different speed of current that's a very obvious change in speed, or you go into an eddy that has a very obvious knife edge seam on it, where not only are the currents going different speeds but also different directions, places like that, you're going to find that you'll get a better drift when you only have 1 fly. Because if you have 2 flies, then they're most likely going to be spread apart into different seams of current or different speeds and directions of current. It's very hard to keep 2 flies in really complex water from having that happen. Almost inevitably, if you make a cast into complex water types like this, 1 fly is going to land in water that's faster than the other fly will, or maybe that fly will land in water that's going the opposite direction of the other fly because it lands in an eddy. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about complex water. And in those situations, having 1 fly tends to be the better choice. Pocket water is the obvious example here, but even in flatter water, when you have the inside corner of a riffle, for example, a lot of times the soft edge that's on the near side may only be 10 to 12 inches across. And fitting 2 flies into that water versus only fitting one, it's a lot easier to fit 1 fly. I always like to keep in mind that if I'm fishing 2 good patterns but I'm drifting them poorly, I might as well be fishing 1 mediocre fly but drifting it well. You're probably going to catch more fish if you show the fish a fly, even if it's the wrong fly, so to speak. You'll catch more fish if that fly is presented well than you will if you show them all the flies in the world that happen to be perfect choices, but you don't show them in a way that makes them look like food because your presentation, or your drift in this case, is poor. Another reason to fish 1 fly is it'll make your life easier when it comes to rigging, at least if you only add a single piece of tippet. Now, you can easily swap back and forth between 1 and 2 flies by having that second fly on a dropper tag and then just clipping that fly off. Another situation where you might want to fish 1 fly is just in shallow water. So if you have water that's less than 12, 15, 18 inches deep, whatever depth you want to put that at, it often makes the most sense to just fish 1 fly, because if you've got 2 flies and they're spaced 18, 20, however many inches apart, if that water isn't at least that deep and you have any sort of vertical angle to your tippet, well, there's no point in having 2 flies, because that second fly up on the dropper tag is going to be in the surface film pretty much, or maybe even out of the water, because you can't fit them both under the water without having a fairly shallow angle in your tippet. So in really shallow water, it really does make the most sense to only have 1 fly. All right, now that we've covered some of the pros or the benefits of fishing 1 fly, let's now talk about the pros or the benefits of fishing 2 flies. The first benefit is simply that you can spread the weight out between 2 flies. There are a lot of rivers, especially rivers in the west, that are tailwaters, or back east, some of the tailwaters as well, that get a lot of pressure, where a lot of the food forms in those specific rivers happen to be pretty small. Lots of midges, little Baetis mayflies, for example. And if you have really large flies on your rig, a lot of times the fish don't react to them very well. And in a lot of locations where you might need a fair amount of weight, if you only have 1 fly, it's going to take a fairly big fly with a fairly big bead in order to get down in that location. But if you've got 2 flies, you can spread that weight between those 2 flies. Both of them can be smaller, and a lot of times both of them will be more effective at catching fish that way. In a lot of the water that I fish size 18 and 20 patterns all the time by fishing 2 flies. And given my tailwater background, growing up fishing a lot of tailwaters, I'm just more comfortable fishing smaller patterns. And a lot of the times I can't fish those smaller patterns if I'm only fishing 1 fly, because I just can't get enough weight without putting a giant bead on that size 18 or 20 pattern. That just kind of defeats the purpose at that point. So I fish probably 2 flies maybe more often than some folks will in a lot of water, mainly so that I can spread that weight out and then end up fishing smaller patterns. Another benefit to fishing 2 nymphs is that you can always cut that top nymph off and put a dry fly on, and suddenly your 2 fly rig has become a dry dropper rig. In this clip, that's exactly what I did. I had 2 nymphs on from a pool below. I looked at this flatter, nice bit of tail out in a pocket water pool. I chopped off the top dropper, put a dry fly on. Well, lo and behold, a fish ate my dry fly, but another fish had also eaten my nymph below. So I ended up with 2 fish, good old double hookup, and in addition, there was a rainbow on the dry fly and a brown trout on the bottom. So that was pretty cool to catch on camera. Another reason to fish 2 flies is that you can sort through patterns more quickly. If you happen to be on a river where the fish do show preferences for certain patterns over others, if you only have 1 fly on, you got to make a lot of changes to sort through more patterns. But if you have 2 flies on, you can sort through patterns in basically half the time, or you can change flies in both locations and end up sorting through a lot more patterns that way. In addition, if you have 2 flies, it gives you the chance to test out various types of patterns in combination. So if you have a drab pattern, for instance, that's more imitative, maybe there's some specific hatch that's going on and you have a drab pattern that looks a lot like the naturals of that insect, but then you combine that with a flashier or more attractive pattern that has neon colors or fluorescent colors or flash built into the fly. If you combine them, put them both on the rig, maybe even swap them in their various places. So swap them between the point and the dropper tag. You can see when you do have the fish show preferences for one over the other, whether maybe it's just the position that they are at on your leader, or they just really want that style of pattern. And then as a result, you can maybe go to 2 patterns that share those characteristics. So if they preferred the drab pattern, you can go to 2 drab patterns and maybe increase your success that much more. Or vice versa, if they preferred that attractor style pattern, go ahead and put on 2 of them. You might find that you catch more fish when you have the same styles of flies in both locations once they've shown a preference for one over the other. Another benefit of fishing those 2 flies, sometimes fish suspend. And as a result, they take flies or nymphs that are drifting mid-column. If you only have 1 point fly and that fly happens to be down near the bottom, there's a good chance that a lot of those fish that might be suspending just a little bit, your fly is going to drift under them and they won't ever see that pattern. I've noticed this a lot when sight fishing. A lot of times I do just fish 1 fly when I'm sight fishing because I want maximum accuracy in where I'm casting. But if my 1 fly happens to be a little bit heavier and it goes under that fish, they never even see it. But if I lighten up, I end up catching that fish. Well, you can play that same game a little bit by not only, having a fly near the bottom that you think is going to park there for those deep dwelling fish, but if you have 2 flies and they're spread 18, 20, 22, 24 inches apart, for example, and there's a little bit of vertical angle in your leader, then that top dropper fly is going to be a ways up in the column. A lot of times fish end up elevating and eating that top dropper fly more than they do the point fly that's down near the bottom. Following up on that last concept, a lot of times the point fly that's down near the bottom will actually slow the drift down of that dropper tag fly that's up above it. Now, when you think about it, that is actually causing drag on that upper fly. And sometimes I suppose that could be a deterrent. But a lot of times I've found that actually having that dropper tag fly up there dangling in the current, headed upstream or pointed upstream, that ends up turning into a lot more takes, and frankly a lot more positive or really hard takes that you get on that dropper tag. And the only way I can explain it is that basically that point fly that's down there slowing down that dropper tag fly makes it look like that dropper tag fly is struggling against the current and trying to swim upstream, whether the fish thinks that it's an emerging pattern or just something that's struggling against the current and looking alive as it goes downstream. It's not a speed or a behavior that I can really replicate in any other way with 1 fly. And so having 2 flies in that instance really does improve the success of that dropper tag fly. Having a large volume fly on the point will increase this characteristic even that much more. So something like a mop or a leggy stone fly or an egg pattern that has a lot of volume for the amount of weight, once that gets to depth, that style of pattern really drifts slowly and kind of slinks along the bottom, and it'll hold whatever fly you have up on the dropper really slowly in that current above the bottom. So let's boil this all down. Where should you be fishing 1 versus 2 flies? Going back to that pro and con list of each rigging, really that informs this decision. In review, 1 fly fishes better in shallow, broken water that has a lot of complexities to the current, where you get knife edge seams, really quick changes in speed of current and even direction of current around eddies. So pocket water, that's a great place to fish 1 fly. Riffles, where you have not only shallow depth, but also maybe a slow edge to a riffle and then a fast center current on the riffle. Think about fishing 1 fly in places like these. And most of the time, if I've got water that's 2 feet deep or shallower, that's water that I will often think about just fishing 1 fly, because that second fly, since it ends up being near to the surface, more or less, that second fly doesn't serve as big a purpose unless you've got a hatch and you happen to see a lot of fish suspended. Still, even in that water that's fairly shallow, you can get those fish that are suspended and eating emerging insects right below the surface. Moving on to 2 flies. If you've got water that's 3 feet deep or deeper, and that's a fairly arbitrary number, it's a sliding scale that could go up or down a little bit from that. But if you've got fairly deep water, on me maybe crotch or waist deep or deeper. That's when I'm more likely to turn to those 2 flies the bulk of the time, because I want to be able to get down deep without having to put on just a single bomb of a fly. And then if you've got less complicated currents, if you've got a seam that's at least a few feet wide, a tongue of current or a seam of current that's a few feet wide that you can fit 2 flies into without having 1 fly on a slow side and 1 fly on a fast side of a seam, then those are areas where fishing 2 flies is beneficial. And then even if you've got fairly complex water, pocket water, for example, in maybe a brawling big river canyon, if it's deeper than 3 feet, you should probably still think about fishing 2 flies anyway, especially if you're having a hard time just getting down with 1, or you're having to fish too big a fly. Take all those variables into account. If you feel like you're having to fish too big a fly to get the fish to eat, consider fishing 2. If you feel like you're ticking bottom too much, or your top fly is near to the surface, or you're watching your splashes of your flies landing on different sides of a fast current seam, or 1 in an eddy, 1 in fast water, then chop that top fly off and go to 1 fly. And then on top of that, you can always put on and remove Sakura paint marker cider somewhere on your tippet, so that you can adjust for the depth changes that you're finding when you go back and forth between 1 fly and 2 fly and shallow water and deep water. And that way you can remain adaptive throughout the day of fly fishing and make sure that you're targeting each piece of water the best way that you can in order to present your fly or flies in the best way possible. Thanks for watching this tactical fly fisher video. I hope it answered maybe your own questions on when you might fish 1 versus 2 flies, and I hope it helps you out the next time you're out there fishing. If you did like it, please give us a thumbs up, give us that like on the video, and subscribe to the Tactical Fly Fisher channel. But most of all, we really appreciate you supporting our store at tacticalflyfisher.com. So come on over to our store and stock up for your next adventure, whether it's fly tying or fly fishing gear. We'll get you sorted out. Thanks for watching.